Hello, and welcome once again to another episode of The Power of Stories with Doctors Schuster and Oxley. This episode's going to be a little bit different. We're going to focus on reviewing a book by a mutual acquaintance. Don't know if we could quite call General McChrystal our friend, but certainly an acquaintance.
You wish, yeah.
And, I was struck on this mission that we have about the power of stories. I was reflecting on each time we do one of these podcasts, we talk about why we think the power of stories has such an underutilized power. And we did a podcast a few weeks ago with Tricia Connolly, and she very kindly posted it on her social media. And I was struck by how she captured the power of stories in her own words. And I wanted to share that because I really felt that it resonated. She said, "I'm a huge believer in the power of stories. And if you stop and think about it for a moment, the notion of storytelling, it's just such a large part of our culture. And it helps us pass on knowledge and information from generation to generation. And we hear bedtime stories as children, and we are taught valuable life lessons through countless stories that others tell us, sometimes formally, sometimes informally, sometimes spontaneously, sometimes rehearsed. We tell our friends and family what we've done during the day, how we got on at school, what adventures we had when we went on vacation. And often they're the most valuable and memorable parts of our lives. They're the things that we carry with us. And our stories also build our own legacy, so that when it's finally time for us to leave this earth, those closest to us gather and tell stories about what we did and what we meant to them, and how we become a very fabric of their lives, even beyond our own mortality. And in that sense, they go on forever. And I just thought that was just such a beautiful way to express the power of stories, and why we think in business we focus too much on instruction books, this is how you do something, and not enough on the power of inspiring people to say, let me tell you a story about something that happened to me, and allow them to interpret and impose upon that their own meanings. What did you think about what Tricia said, Helmut?
I'm blown away by your intro. It was really good. I loved it. I was emotionally touched, yeah. And this is in many ways the essence of a story, yeah. I think the reason why we remember a story, it's because it evokes feelings, reactions, and that's where we remember them. And you do know that I'm a big fan of Tricia, always have been. She doesn't believe that, but I'm really a big fan of Tricia. And what I really like about her and her ability to articulate things in a very, very concise way. And what she posted about stories is 100% right, and I agree with that 100%. But again, it basically created emotion, evoked emotions, and that's what I think is the power of stories, yeah.
So that's a lovely bridge to the rest of this podcast. This podcast is dedicated to General McChrystal's new book on character. Now, full disclosure, Helmut and I have had some interactions with General McChrystal back in 2018. He hosted an offsite for us when we were back in BP and told stories about how he unlocked the full potential of the special forces of the US military when he was in Iraq, and how he inspired. It was very much a leadership briefing about how you inspire people to work in a much more networked economy using modern tools of communication. General McChrystal, for those of you who don't know, is a retired US Army general. He led the Joint Special Operations Command from 2003 to 2008. He had a very long 30-plus year, very senior career in the US military. He left after somewhat of a, I don't know if it was controversial, but there was an incident that was reported in a magazine that he was a little bit critical of the Obama regime, and so he, given the man he is, he tendered his resignation, and President Obama accepted it and he left. And since then, he's dedicated his life to inspiring leadership. And I would say his main thrust is leadership with integrity, or leadership, to bridge to the book, leadership with character. So what are your reflections of General McChrystal, Helmut?
Yeah, I think, as you rightly said, that was in 2018, and sometimes you remember speakers and sometimes you don't remember speakers. And I still remember him, but what I remember most is actually the attention he commanded in the room. when you corporate conference, and remember that, yeah? Sometimes people whisper and they talk and they have coffee and they get up 50 times. When he talked, it was quiet. And that always means for me, people paid attention and they hit a nerve. And that's exactly what he did. I have to admit I have not read his book, but thanks by the way, for briefing me a bit. I find it amazing. The concept of character and the concept of integrity is so important. So I really enjoyed it. It was like 8 years after our Gulf of Mexico incident, as you probably well remember. I think you also were working with us with the ethics monitor. We had an ethics monitor at the time. And he also said one thing, it's all about integrity. And I think that's very important.
So Gen McChrystal has recently published a book on character. He describes it as his last book. He's written a few others that have all been New York Times bestseller. This latest book came out, I think, in May, has been on the New York Times bestseller list since then. And it's simply titled On Character. And in the book, let me describe what he attempts to do. He tells lots of stories in the book about his life in the military and to some extent beyond the military, and how they have forged his outlook on life. And he says that he thinks that character has become something that we pay too little attention about. That whether it be in public life or private life, that the world has become, if you will, a bit too superficial. It has become willing to outsource points of view to other people, that we just adopt what we hear either on the internet or to some extent either in the newspapers, this notion that we don't think critically about what's going on and we don't ask ourselves the question, who are we at our core? And there's a lovely bridge here to some of the writings that we have done as Doctors Schuster and Oxley with the Chez Sinope fable, which ultimately is an inquiry about who are you really and how are you authentically following that path, which is your own unique path in professional life. So the core of his book is about character, and he defines character as a formula. Now, Helmut and I have some disagreement about how much we like formulas. I love formulas. I think as a kid, when I was doing algebra, I tried to reduce life to different formulas. I loved playing around with the sort of moving the things from one side to the other of the equation. So McChrystal says character is a combination of your convictions and the discipline with which you hold to those convictions. And the book is essentially set out in 3 chapters or 3 sections. One talks about convictions, how he has come to hold his points of view on life, what is important, and then the discipline with which he has tried to live his life by those convictions. And he said that having convictions is only as good as what the price that you're willing to pay to hold to those convictions. Equally, if you have strong discipline about something, but your convictions are really not that well thought through, that's also sort of reckless in a different way. And it's really very engaging for a book that might sound like it's trying to impart a lesson which is a little technical, because he goes through all these anecdotes about how he's lived his life and come to the conclusions. He gives a lovely example, for example, about, he says, lying. We all talk about morally we shouldn't lie, but do we really hold to that? I mean, equally, he says, thou shalt not kill is a golden rule. But he was in the military and part of his job was killing. And so there are very important nuances to, well, I'm going to try not to kill. That's not something I want to do. But there are certain situations where I feel that my duty is to prosecute a war on behalf of my country. And in those situations, the shalt not kill thing is kind of hard to stand by. So he really tries to unpick each of these. And what I like most about it is that it's nuanced. I think we live in a world that has become so divided that there's sort of lightning rods on either side, and those views aren't held gently. They're sort of, if you don't hold this point of view, then I think you're wrong, plain wrong. And what McChrystal, I think, does is go through each of these, and in a very nuanced and thoughtful way, he says, look, these points of view are where my North Star is, but there are caveats around how they're applied. And I love that kind of play on ambiguity, that life is not black and white. It is a little bit more nuanced than that. Helmut, I know that you haven't had a chance to read the entire book, but what are your reflections on the main thrust
Well,
of On
I
Character?
mean, I did a bit of research and I've ordered the book. I think it's waiting in London, but I'm in Vienna right now. But there are a number of things I really did like. I did like him as a person when we basically met him in 2018. But I think the key thing is, I think he's very right. You need to form and articulate your convictions. You need to basically, ideally, early on in your life, be very clear what do I stand for and what are the red lines I'm going to cross and what are the red lines I'm not going to cross. Yeah, I think that is very, very important, and that's what we should hopefully do in our teens and early 20s to have this North Star, as he calls it. But I think this is for me the key thing, what I think he probably tries to get across. We don't live in a very binary world. Yeah? I think the world is extremely complex and nothing is really black and white. Yeah? And I think we all have a certain level of knowledge about what's going on, but we never have the full context. So it's really, really difficult, yeah, to basically form an opinion about what's currently going on. Like this weekend we saw the US basically entering what the press considers a war in Iran. Yeah. Now, basically, everyone has an opinion on that, but does everyone really have an informed opinion? Because we're all needing data points. Yeah. So I think it's really, really important to understand that we live in a world which becomes more complex and less binary. And I think any book, any thoughts on that, I think can be very, very useful and helpful for our own development. So I'm really delighted that you picked this book as your story, David.
So the key takeaways for me in the book, and let me just first of all reinforce, I think it is a story. I think it fits within the context of our podcast about telling stories. And the reason I think it fits into that is that what Stanley McChrystal does in the book is explain through the telling of his life stories why he has reached the convictions that he has. So he shares stories, for example, about working in Afghanistan. And he says that it occurred to him during the struggles with trying to bring about the post 9/11 fight against the Taliban that a lot of the world's divisiveness is an accident of where you were born. You know, if you were born in the Middle East, you were typically born into a Islamic family, inculcated certain points of view about the world and about how you live life. And if you were born by accident in the United States, it was probably Christian, and how these things set you on a path potentially to be at odds with one another, when in reality, when you put aside some of these religious ethoses and dogma, that we had many things in common. And he found in working with the supposed corrupt regime in Afghanistan that actually there wasn't that much difference between us, and yet we were at war with one another. And I found things like that fascinating. Those stories resonate on so many different levels, that when you think about how conflict occurs in the workplace, for example, isn't it a lot of times just because we have different context and we assume that someone is either out to get us or that they're not a good actor. We have projected our own insecurities onto them, or there are things that we carry with us that somehow we had sort of programmed into our brains when we were little that get in the way of taking people at face value, at taking people as they are. I thought that was extraordinarily powerful. That a general in the US Army who was there to prosecute war was able to see that a lot of the conflict was to some extent an accident of where we were born in the world.
Yeah, I mean, David, I think that's very wise, and I think that's very real. I mean, we all are born into context, and probably the first 10, 15, 20 years in our lives, we just live in that context, and it becomes the truth. If you're born in like Saudi Arabia, that's the truth. If you're born in America, it's a different truth. And that's why I think it's so important, and I think that's what we try in our books, is basically how can we actually start reprogramming our brain in a way that we start thinking in a different context. I mean, as you well know, I left my context. At the age of 15, went to America. And it was just basically a big awakening, because everything which was good and right and excellent that made me like a popular guy in Austria did not work in the US anymore, because I didn't play American football, I didn't play baseball or softball, yeah. And suddenly I was from basically high school here in Austria to somebody who was basically a member of the chess club. Yeah? And I think it was probably the most interesting experience about relativity. Yeah? And I wish that everyone could actually experience that and try to basically stand in the other side's shoes. I think it would be a much better world. And in a business context, I think high-performing companies have this ability to really try to stand in other companies' shoes, in the customer's shoes, in other employees' shoes, because I find it always like amazing, and figure, well, when I travel or whatever you do, everyone talks about customer centricity, and you sometimes wonder, has any one of them ever been in the shoes of the customer? And I think this is actually a very important concept, trying to stand in the shoes of another person. And I find it amazing that somebody who's worked in the military basically has the ability to do that, and that shows a lot of maturity and wisdom, as Gen McChrystals probably exhibits in this book. I'm really looking forward to reading the book.
And this demonization of people, sadly, I think the current political regime in many countries is really playing on the idea that immigrants are somehow all bad, or that perhaps in the context of Iran, that somehow Iran is all bad, as opposed to perhaps just the sort of regime that seems to be going in the wrong direction. But the idea of painting things with broad brushes, I felt when I was reading some aspects of the book that it played into what we were trying to do with the Groundhog Career, when we were saying that Emi Silva, one of our favorite characters from the book, this South American, I had him as a Brazilian, who was trying to claw his way up through the corporate ladder as best he could. And he was coming from, if you will, the wrong side of the streets. He was a street fighter. And that our protagonist, our not sort of anti-hero of the book, Shea Sinope, had projected onto him this sort of, while my rival, I must win, I must defeat you, you are the personification of evil. And it's okay, then it becomes okay by, if you will, dehumanizing the person, making them a caricature. It allows yourself to feel okay about the tactics that you use to undermine them, because you don't think of them in the same way as you would think of in the context of our books. Alan Elpis, for example, Shea wouldn't have gone about working with Alan in the way that he did with Emi. In the book, what he does is he literally tries to undermine Emi in very unethical ways, and we try and then paint that picture, that full circle of saying, and where did that get you? Ultimately, it becomes quite self-destructive, and that's essentially the lesson that we've learned over 30 or 40 years in the professional world, that when you start to paint people as somehow not entirely human, or there's an otherness about them, it allows you some sort of permission in your own mind to do things that are not high integrity, not morally or ethically equivalent to what you would do with your friends. You treat them differently, you put them in a different category, but it ultimately destroys yourself. In a way, it's very self-destructive. Did you see that parallel?
Absolutely. I think you raise a very important point. Otherness is always perceived as a risk, a danger. And I find it really amazing how in a system, in the Western world, we're probably the best universities, best schools, best high schools, how we still are unable to unlearn that. We have been talking about diversity inclusion for like last 10, 15, 20, 30 years. Think, how far are we in societies, in the corporate world? We have not progressed a lot. Yeah? There's still basically a lot of judgment going on in companies. Certain things are good, certain things are bad. And I think that's what's the power of storytelling. And that, I think, is so important, to listen deeply to stories and put yourself in the shoes of other people, like Emi or Shea. And if people were much better in doing that, I think we would live in a better world. I think that's so important. Yeah? Through my work with EFS, which is an intercultural student exchange program, and the Youth Assembly, I've seen so many instances where people just realized, wow, the girl from Ecuador is pretty much like me, or the guy from Saudi Arabia, Egypt. And I think it's really, really important that we educate our young people to appreciate diversity, difference. I think we just don't do enough. The good news is that people start reading again. I find that actually really amazing because books can make such a difference. And I know, David, that you are a reader as well, and we both were reading a lot. And I see more and more young people reading actual books, which I think is very encouraging.
I went back recently and read Franz Kafka, Metamorphosis, partly inspired by some of this stuff that about identity and about how we have an image of ourselves, and how as that image changes, the people around us change their relationship, and how the world to some extent paints people in binary ways. And I come back full circle a lot. I mentioned Franz perhaps to sound cleverer than I really am. These books tell stories that help you tackle this world that we live in that wants to label people and compartmental people. I think whether it be the media that I'm not one of these great woke people that would say that the media are all fake, but I do think that you have to look at it all through a lens of critical thinking. You have to be able to filter out the facts from the opinion. You have to be able to then independently put the pieces together to come to your own conclusion. And I think, again, through the writing that we have done, what we've been trying to encourage is the idea of saying what is going on in this story isn't necessarily what it appears on the surface. There are some things going on that we need to be able to be open to, first of all, look for, interrogate, and then independently come to some sort of conclusion. And this is a large part of what McChrystal says in his book. He says probably the single biggest thing that we have a problem with is that we are too quick to adopt a point of view that's given to us on TikTok or Instagram or Facebook, or to some extent on TV. But the point is that rather than interrogate that, rather than hold that slightly at a distance and say, before I adopt this point of view, I'm going to interrogate whether I really believe in it and what the consequences are of believing in it, we adopt it and it becomes somewhat tribal. So I'm part of this particular tribe that I don't really think too deeply about what it believes, but I align myself with them, and then I get carried down that particular path. You're a fan of Kafka. I was about to tee you up for that.
Of course. I mean, of course, basically you grew up in Austria, you grew up with Kafka and like a lot of literature. But there's one thing I just want to do a story. You're going to love that, David. I did my studies here in Vienna, much of my studies, and I had a professor for my PhD, and basically he had the reputation. Everyone said, well, his list of books he requests the readers like very, very long, but reality is it doesn't really matter whether we read them or not. The only thing he wants, to understand whether your ability to think, whether you can think independently. He's not going to give you a PhD unless you think independently. And it was really funny because like this guy now is the president of Austria, Alexander van der Bellen, Sascha van der Bellen. He is actually like in his 80s, I think now. And so I wrote him a little email a few 2 years ago, said, thank you so much and congratulations. He was re-elected for the second term. And he wrote back and said, because I said, like, listen, there's one thing you really taught me, and this is basically how to think. You gave me the gift of thinking, and he was very kind about that. But it's so true, He didn't ask any questions that had anything remotely to do with any of the books he required us to read. And I think if our books can make people think, I would just love that. I mean, I really think then we've succeeded if people think a bit deeper and a bit more basically holistic. If that's what our books do, I would be delighted. And I think so would you, David, I guess.
Absolutely. So just wrapping up the conversation about On Character, we absolutely go out. If you haven't read it, go and read it. It's available on Kindle. It's available in hardback and paperback. It's a good read. It's not a long read. I think it's only a couple of 100 pages, and it goes by quickly. Each of the chapters is 5 or 6 pages, and they each contain a story or a particular lesson takeaway. Probably the two final things that I'd share on my reflections are this ability to be open-minded. This ability to hold things loosely. I was reading an interview with Michael Lewis, the author of Liar's Poker and Moneyball and all of this, and he was saying that he has learnt to live in this current world in a more healthy way by just holding things loosely. And I liked this phrase about saying, I might have a point of view, but I hold it loosely. I'm willing to take on someone else's different perspective. I'm not simply going to attack them because they have a different point of view. I'm willing to ask, why do you feel differently about it? And holding things loosely, I think, is connected with humility. I think it's the idea that you don't have the arrogance to believe that you somehow are perfectly clear in every point of view that you might have, that you're willing to listen to other people, particularly different points of view. And on that point of humility, what I love particularly about General McChrystal is that we sent him a copy of our third book and he read it. And I found this, I mean, I don't know if it's humility or generosity or what, but the generosity and finding the time when he was just about to launch his New York Times best-selling book to read our book and then to write us a little note to say how much he enjoyed it. I just felt, for a man that's obviously very, very busy, it was such a lovely thing for him to do and to some extent encapsulated his character. So what are your final thoughts, Herr Schuster?
Well, final thought. I mean, you just raised another question. It's basically humility. Real humility is something which is not appreciated enough, and there aren't that many people who basically exhibit humility. I mean, it's one of my favorite books, basically level 5 leader, from good to great, and let's finish on that. A bit more humility would actually create a much better world, and we need that right now.
Beautiful. So if you've enjoyed this podcast, this is Drs. Schuster and Oxley, The Power of Stories. We are trying to send these podcasts out every 2 weeks. Typically, we'll have a guest. On this occasion, you have had to put up just with Drs. Schuster and Oxley. Hopefully, that hasn't been too much of a disappointment. We've today spent our time talking about General McChrystal's book on character and the thoughts that we had on reading that and how it applies to our mission to try and help people navigate a professional life on their own genuinely and unique, authentic terms. If you've liked this, then watch the other or listen to the other podcasts. Follow us on social media. We are active on Instagram, which I love our Instagram channel at the moment. There's some great content on that. LinkedIn, we're quite active on. Obviously, there are the books. And when I say the books, there are 2 out currently and a third coming in November. And finally, a newsletter. We do publish a newsletter each month, which is one of the things I really enjoy doing. I know, Helmut, you also enjoy the newsletter. It's a fun thing to write.
And they're very good. They're very good. So much about humility. They're very good.
So with that, let me wrap this podcast by saying it's goodbye from me. And it's goodbye
from me.
Bye-bye, everyone.